We're going to pick apart the budget, a budget that I guess provides, some are calling it a sugar hit, for what we call the squeezed middle class, which I think is basically a talking point that the National Party have banged on about so much in the last week or two that it has joined the New Zealand lexicon, the New Zealand vocabulary for this election. We're just teeing up, Eric. We actually bumped up the program because I want to get into it. What else have we got today? We're going to be talking to David Seymour. Would have loved to talk to Grant Robertson, or indeed anyone from the government. Not available. In fact, no one's been from the government's been available on anything since the platform began. Oh, maybe something's going on there. I'm not sure. Also, really looking forward to having Professor Des Gorman, one of the country's leading academics and observers of health policy, and we're going to talk to Eric towards the end of the show this morning. Sorry, not Eric, to Des. We're going to talk to Des about the changes in COVID reporting and this $11 billion spend on our health budget. Will that be money well spent, or are we rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic? Right now, though, we are joined from the New Zealand Initiative by Eric Crampton. Eric, welcome to the program. We've got you, I think.
You started me early. It's all good.
All right. Eric, we were talking about bracket creep and tax changes last time you were on the program. I'm wondering if we could start with this $350, $27 a week for a couple of months for anyone earning under 70. Was there potentially a better way to deliver that money to the pockets of what we're now calling the squeezed middle?
Of course. So bracket creep just is what happens when inflation keeps moving and the tax bands don't move. So they were last adjusted in 2011. We talked about that last time. And when Grant Robertson announced the $350, the number kind of tweaked in the back of my head because I've been playing with these numbers for a few weeks, just annoyed by the lack of adjustment to the tax thresholds. $350 is the same amount as the tax that's somebody who is at the top of the lowest tax band. That's the extra tax that they're paying if you're on $19,000, which is where the $14,000 line should now be. You're paying an extra $350 in tax because of the extra $5,000 of inflation that you're being taxed on. So it is a bit coincidental. I wonder whether they are setting the stage later for some tax bracket adjustments. The way that they've done it, though, is it's very frustrating. So whenever anybody talks about adjusting the tax thresholds, the response from Labor and the left tends to be, well, that would give more money to people at the top rather than people at the bottom. Now, one of the reasons for that is it always gives the most within any particular tax band to people who are right at the top of it, right? So if you're on $14,000 right now, lifting the tax band up to 19 doesn't really do much for you. If you're at 15, it does a little bit. If you're at 19, well, it does a lot. And anybody over 19 gets the full amount of that bit of adjustment and all the way up. What Labor has done is given $350 as a one-off to anybody who's earning less than $70,000. So it avoids giving the same bump to those above, which would have been given if you'd adjusted the tax bands upwards.
Okay, I'm understanding that. Why have they done it that way, in your opinion?
One, to save a bit of money, and two, to avoid the impression of giving money to, well, richer people who've been taxed a lot more through inflation without an adjustment to the tax bands, because they don't really like giving more money to people at the top of the bands.
All right. My question would be, and I don't know if you've crunched these numbers, clearly the cost of living has already gone up. Inflation is on the rise. Interest rates are on the way up. For these people earning $70,000 or less, does 2 months, $350 over a couple of months, in any way actually get them back to where they were a year ago or 6 months ago?
Well, I haven't run the year ago or 6 months ago numbers. I was looking at the numbers since Labor took office in 2017-18 tax year. The 350 only matches the tax bracket creep for the 10.5% band, right? So you've got a lot of people now that are paying 17.5 that should have been paying 10.5. It does nothing for those who have jumped from the 17.5 bracket into the 30% bracket, who should still be paying 17.5. So it used to be that you had to be earning more than about 58% of all wage and salary earners to get onto the 30% band. Now you just have to be at the median. It's done nothing for that increment of extra tax, and it's of course done nothing for those further up. And
it is temporary. It is temporary. Lasting wise, if you're setting a budget, if you're, I don't know, looking to take on extra debt to buy an EV because you've cashed in the clunker, really long term, it does nothing to take pressure off, the old battling middle class New Zealander.
It does less, right? And it doesn't help your expectations. So what I was really hoping for, as the very least that Labour could have been doing in this budget, recognizing, okay, they're a left-wing government, they have certain priorities around spending, they don't want to be giving tax breaks, especially at the top. The very least I might have hoped for was a signaling that from 1 April of next year, that's when the tax year changes, when everything tends to be adjusted, that's when they when they change the minimum wage, when they change everything else. They could have announced that from 1 April of next year, they would be inflation adjusting all of the tax thresholds, and that they would continue to do that on an ongoing basis. Now,
we're getting a little bit of cut up there, Eric. Just hang on, and we'll just see if we... You're back with us, I think.
I'm back. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Oh, I need to update the fiber.
Yeah, you do.
Phone cable doesn't always quite do it. It was almost too much to hope for that they would undo the effects of cumulative bracket creep. So the tax brackets haven't been adjusted since 2011. You might want them to adjust from 2017, 2018, when Labour took office, but the least you could have hoped for was that they would have adjusted them from next year for just the past couple of years' inflation. Now, if they've done that, you can start forming expectations about how much money you're going to have in your pocket. You can form expectations around how much you should be spending. $350 as a one-off, well, it's kind of nice and all, but it does a lot less in helping you decide whether you should be making some of these other changes in your spending.
Right, and the fuel tax cuts being extended, the subsidised public transport being extended, Eric, that also is just, and I think it has been described as a sugar hit, it has no structural or long-lasting effect on our economic performance or indeed people's pockets.
Well, if anything, it has a negative effect, especially the fuel tax rebate. So the biggest policy issue is Labour needs to get climate change right. This is really important to them, and it will be even more important for any future Labour Greens government, right? And the precedents that they are setting here in giving fuel tax rebate whenever they're under a little bit of pressure on cost of energy, that doesn't bode well for the climate response if we're going to be having much higher carbon prices in future. Because if they have knee-jerk reactionary responses whenever those prices go up, it'll be a mistake. They'll end up undoing a lot of the good that the ETS could do in reducing carbon use. Now, they had a better option, right? So the government will be earning an awful lot in revenues through the emissions trading scheme. The last update from the budget economic and fiscal update, Treasury was forecasting, now going from memory, I think it was $1.388 billion in ETS revenues for the coming year, and it would be enough for a carbon dividend of just over $1,000 per family of four. So if you divide it up equally among 5.1 million people, lump that into 4 payments for a family of 4, it'd be about just over $1,000. That would be a better way of handling this, right? Instead of giving people effectively a big subsidy to drive, and especially a subsidy for driving the most fuel inefficient vehicles, because that's who benefits the most out of a petrol excise holiday, you'd be giving everybody a lump sum. You wouldn't be giving them incentive to be driving more, but you would be giving them the ability to start updating what they wanted to spend money on for preparing for a lower carbon future. Now, they've done this instead through this crazy cash for clunkers scheme, or I think they're calling it the vehicle scrappage scheme. I don't know if they want to avoid the stink from the American implementation of it that got called cash for clunkers and really didn't work well. They put that through anyways. It's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. If you had to make some guesses about who's going to do well out of it, okay, poor people aren't going to have quite enough money even with that to be able to afford an EV. Who might? Well, I imagine myself in 5 years, or somebody who's like me in about 5 years, whose kids are late teens, early 20s, starting off on their own households. I could totally imagine, well, if my kid happened to have a really bad car, I could bankroll him the difference and he could get a nice car and I might be able to use it as a second car, right? Maybe to
Yeah.
conveniently park at the house.
So you're
So it'd be
saying
good for
the government actually could have delivered more relief to the poor and the squeezed
yeah.
middle class rather than just having the sugar hit from actually sharing the emissions trading dividend, the carbon dividend, with everyone in the country.
Well, absolutely. And it would have set a much sounder structural basis for the climate response, because every time then that fuel prices go up or power prices go up, anything like that, the government could just come back and say, that's why we gave every Kiwi a check for about every Kiwi family of four a check for about $1,100 at the start of the year to help you deal with these problems and prepare for a higher carbon cost future. And that just takes the political wind out of all the attacks around energy costs, right?
Yeah.
Because you've already given people the money back that you've taken from them from the carbon payments. When Canada ran this, it was in March. It was just beautiful. So Canada has had this in place for a while, and they were facing the same pressure that we were facing around fuel prices and the like. The environment minister stood up and said, this is why most of this isn't due to carbon prices. It's international stuff. But this is why we gave you all this big carbon dividend at the start of the year, and 80% of Canadian families get more out of the carbon dividend than they pay in. He could just say that, and it's true, because these payments are always progressive.
Eric, let's look slightly bigger picture and things that make my eyes glaze over, but I know they're important. Looking at this budget over the next 3-4 years in terms of the government's book, what about our proportion of spending to GDP? What about our debt levels as a nation over the next wee while? What's the prognosis? What should take out from those figures?
Well, they have pushed out the date for getting back into surplus, and some of this is a worry. So if you'll remember, about a month ago, Treasury came out with a new set of fiscal rules that they'd worked through with the finance minister. So previously, New Zealand had a debt to GDP target where they were trying to keep it down in the 20% debt to GDP ratio. There'd been bipartisan consensus over this for decades, where you'd take on debt during things like the GFC, during things like the Christchurch earthquakes, and then you'd pay it down again and try and keep it down around 20% of GDP so that you'd have tons of headroom if you had a recession combined with an earthquake. So they wanted to maintain that space in case of a couple of emergencies happening at the same time, and they didn't want to wind up in a spot where international lenders could have us over a barrel again, as they did in the early 80s. Now, the change to these fiscal rules, Treasury warned that they would require a lot more fiscal discipline. So what's happened is they've shifted it from being a target to a ceiling. So instead of targeting 20% debt to GDP ratio, we now have a debt ceiling of 50%, but with some revisions on the accounting on how they deal with the New Zealand Super Fund. Now, Treasury warned that this would take more fiscal discipline, that debt ceilings can wind up over time becoming something like a target if you don't keep a tight eye on spending. So they were recommending, and the new fiscal rules agreed, that you'd be maintaining normal time budget surpluses of 0 to 2%. So the government wouldn't be spending more than it's taking in tax revenue unless something bad has happened. Now, what sort of things could be something bad? Well, big recessions, high unemployment, right? So we still have COVID around, but we have a very tight labor market. The Budget Economic and Fiscal Update says that we are now running over capacity, and we have been running over capacity for the past couple of years. That's why we've had pretty substantial inflation, that the economy is running hot. The Reserve Bank has been pushing a lot of money in. That money comes into the system. People buy a lot more stuff. Companies, their inventories go down. They start buying more inputs, hiring more workers to try and fill that back up again, starts bidding all of the input prices up, starts bidding wages up. And it's not really sustainable. We've had an inflation hit to real wages, which has made workers relatively cheaper. That is being bid back up again. We will wind up coming back to an equilibrium on it. But the worst thing that you can do is have a big fiscal push in the middle of having an overheated economy. And we are still having a big fiscal push because we're still having net stimulus coming out of the government. They are still running deficits in the middle of a positive output gap of, I'm going from memory again, it was something like 1.7% of GDP.
All right, the other spending, and there is, nearly $6 billion of new spending here, looking at the health budget separately, $11 billion of spending there. Can we afford this stuff, Eric? Simple question. If you were balancing, the New Zealand household budget, can we afford this stuff? Are these must-haves or nice-to-haves?
Well, I guess it depends what you mean by afford, right? So Treasury also did warn, and Thomas Coughlin had picked this up in some reporting yesterday, that it isn't just the $6 billion, right? They have also added these multi-year appropriations that will start spending on some of these categories for next year and the year after. That means that there's less room in the budgets for next year and the year after to spend on other things, including just normal inflation adjustments, because the price of everything is going up. Government spends money on lots of stuff. The prices of all the things that government buys will be going up as well. They need some headroom to be able to spend next year and the year after, if they don't want to be trimming expenditure in other areas, and the current government doesn't seem to like trimming spending in other areas. They've not really left themselves the room to deal with that, and there were warnings that there'd have to be either spending cuts or tax increases to deal with it. So I prefer smaller government overall, so I wouldn't have gone this way. Would have been looking at more reductions, and especially going back over some of the projects that were put in almost as make work during the immediate COVID response that seem not to have dealt to yet. Instead, we've got a substantial expansion in the size of government relative to, everything else, and that will be continuing.
And we have, in effect, made a whole lot of New Zealanders more reliant on a government handout, albeit temporary, than were before. We have increased people's dependence rather than independence, haven't we?
The 350 is giving some people back some of the extra tax that government just took from them through inflation, but did it in, I just hate this kind of a setup, right? So government taxes you more than you should have been taxed because they don't adjust the inflation thresholds, and then out of the...
We got him? No, we seem to have lost Eric for some reason. That's fine. And I think he was saying what I've always thought. Budgets are often so it's like someone who's nicked some money off you, giving a small percentage of it back and say, would you mind saying thank you for our generosity?